Welcome back to the Carrot Poker School Grade 3. Today we are on to Lecture 5 and today's topic is calling bets. We're going to be going into detail on winning, losing and indifferent calls when you're facing a bet of various sizes and how to tell the difference. I want to revise something we discussed back in Grade 2. We first introduced this in Lecture 7 if you want to go back and have a look. This is the bluff catching system. We broadly separate hands that we can have when facing a bet into three vague categories. Value beaters are the strongest category. These are hands that not only do they beat all of our opponent's bluffs, assuming that our opponent is polarizing when betting the turn or the river, but will also beat some value hands or at least chop with one or more value combos. The idea with these hands is that they're incredibly good for calling because our average bluff catcher, which is the next band down, a hand that wouldn't ever chop or win against the value bet in villain's range, is indifferent to call on average, and therefore a value beater is plus EV to call. Bluff catchers, as I say, these are hands that do beat all bluffs in villain's range but don't beat a single value bet or even chop with one. Bluff catchers come in all shapes and sizes. Some of them are really strong because they have positive removal effects. We talked a lot about this in the last lecture. In Lecture 4, when they unblock bluffs and block value bets, they're going to be better. When they have more redraw when behind, so if you do run into your opponent's value range and you have a bluff catcher with reasonable redraw, that's going to be a good thing. And also how robust they are against our opponent's bluffing range. If we have a very low pair, such as pocket fours on a board that's quite high, while that will be a bluff catcher, meaning that we are far ahead of all of villain's bluffs, or most of them at least, we're not losing to any, we're going to struggle because not only do we have very limited improvability, but we're also going to be susceptible to villain outdrawing us when they have their bluffing range. A lot of these C grade bluff catchers, the bad ones, are going to suffer from this kind of attribute, from not having robust enough equity when ahead and not having good enough redraw when behind. When we get to the river, the grade of a bluff catcher, whether it's A, B or C, is going to fall solely on the property of the blockers of that hand. Frail hands are hands that cannot beat one or more bluffs in villain's range. You may have a hand that's usually winning against a bluff, but not always, and if that hand doesn't have significant redraw for the sizing you're facing, you're just going to be folding. Frail hands aren't always folds on the turn. In fact, in position they can very often be calls, because in many cases we favour calling with hands that don't have robustness, that don't have showdown value, when they have implied odds to quite nutty holdings that can entitle us to a lot of the pot on the branches of the tree where those hands get there. But in general, when we're out of position on the turn, we're going to be folding or raising more often with frail hands, although some of them can still call. And then on the river, obviously a frail hand just becomes a pure fold against the bet, unless villain is dramatically over bluffing. We're not going to be calling a bet where we're losing to every value combo and some bluff combos. It follows that if the average EV of calling the average grade B bluff catcher is 0, then the EV of calling a frail hand on the river is always losing. Here's a rough breakdown of how you should be reacting with these 5 categories of hand, 3 broad categories and then another 3 subcategories within the bluff catcher region against various sizes. With a value beater, the idea is that this hand is just incredibly powerful and is going to be a plus EV call against someone who's not under bluffing regardless of the sizing that's chosen. We should note that the hand's propensity to actually be a value beater is also going to change with sizing. So if villain's betting small, like B33, we can infer that their range theoretically is going to contain a lot of combos that we can beat, even if we don't have a particularly strong looking showdown value hand. Villain may be value betting, for example, third pair or second pair on the river, oftentimes for B33, particularly where there's not been a lot of filtering thus far in the hand, and therefore we can have a value beater with a hand that looks fairly average, but is actually a second pair that outkicks some of our opponent's value range, for example. When we face a B150, villain's range will be much stronger for value betting, and very few hands will actually earn the title of value beater in our range. The ones that do will in fact just be quite obvious calls against the bigger sizing. I would say the trickiest part about identifying value beaters in your range is trying to ascertain when you have a value beater as opposed to a mere bluff catcher against a smaller and trickier bet size to play against. With our catchers, bluff catchers will simplify to saying catcher from now on if I remember to. We're going to be calling these whenever we are facing a small bet, as long as the catcher is grade A. Grade A again is going to mean scoring well in the properties of being far ahead against villain's bluffs, having redraw against villain's value if it's the turn, and having good blocker properties. Only the blocker properties will matter on the river for the grading of a bluff catcher. Against B75 and B33 we will always call a grade A bluff catcher. We'll usually call it as well against B150. Obviously, we can't get by in life by only calling value beaters, we just don't have enough of these. But we will mix some fold from time to time, even with some of our good bluff catchers against an overbet, because we're just meant to be folding more often. If you're meant to be folding 60% of your range and you do have some nutted hands in there, you do end up folding a few of your good bluff catchers, but there will be ones that are just above the threshold that will call, even against an overbet. It's worth pointing out at this juncture that while we're separating these hands into 3 distinct groups, these are really just drawing lines in the sand. These are just somewhat arbitrary boundaries because in reality, there's just simply a spectrum of bluff catchers that's much more finely detailed, finely grained than this 3-tier system would have you believe. But we do need to break it down. We need to condense the theory here so that it's more implementable, and that's why we think in terms of A, B, and C. But the point would be that against something like B150, you might call your best grade A bluff catchers and fold your ones that are on the borderline between A and B. Against an overbet, you have to fold the majority of your range, so you end up folding B bluff catchers and C bluff catchers pretty much all of the time. These hands would be indifferent against smaller sizes though. For example, a grade B bluff catcher will be indifferent against the B75 on average. And that makes a lot of sense because we need to fold around 40-43% of our range against the B75. And because we have a few value beater combos in there, we have more against B75, that'll be some of our range. That'll account for maybe 10-15% of our range, but the rest really just comes from calling about half of our bluff catchers to get up to that 57% defense frequency, the opposite of the 43% pot odds norm fold equity. There will be situations where our range is doing really well, we're in position, villain is over bluffing, and we will over defend, but this is just the nuts and bolts of the spot. If villain B33s, you're going to have to continue 75% of the time, and this is going to mean calling not just your value beaters and grade A bluff catchers, but all of your grade B bluff catchers as well, and even some of your grade C. When you face B75 with a grade B catcher, that's your indifference point there, and you will fold these average catchers on average to a B150. You'll want to think about villain sizing first and foremost and make sure that you don't fall into the very natural and human trap of ignoring sizing and just looking at your hand. When we've studied mass data, and I go over a lot of this in my Grade E Exploitative Carrot Poker School course, what we observe is that people are underly elastic. While a solver or GTO bot will react optimally and gradually to increases in their opponent's bet sizing, slowly beginning to shed more and more combos of their range, mixing higher and higher fold frequencies with certain grades of catcher against certain sizes, what we see is that humans fail to make this distinction. While there is some elasticity, meaning that the human does react to sizing and will fold more to bigger bets, there's not enough. But yet, you sometimes still hear students worry that if they bet too big, villain will fold too often. Usually there's not enough of an increase. I'd encourage you guys to be really sentient about what sizing you're facing first and just what that means for how you're playing your catchers. It's really quite difficult to make sense, for a human at least, of some kind of requirement like I have to defend 65% of my range. I think that's really difficult to do. But what we can do is learn what we do with different grades of catcher against different sizes, fill in the gaps if we face a sizing in between and estimate, and then get good at identifying which type of catcher our hand actually is. This is how we get close to an optimal defense frequency without feeling like we're just guessing and drawing arbitrary lines in our range at different points. When we have a bad bluff catcher or grade C hand, what's going to happen here is that we're going to be mixing against B33 now. We can fold occasionally, and we do have some frail hands that we have to fold, so we have to be careful that we even mix call with bad looking bluff catchers against B33, and then we can fold against the bigger sizes with these lousy catchers. It'll be no surprise to you that humans do a dreadful job of defending against B33 according to data, and the reason for this is that they just don't react enough to the small sizing. Bad bluff catchers tend to look lousy. They're things like underpairs, king high, bad ace high. They don't look good, they don't look nice. They might even be like queen jack high and some very wide blind versus blind composition where the texture is not so easy to connect with. What you have to do in these situations is start off by remembering that even your lousy catchers are going to be mixing call, because if you don't, you generate for your opponent an incredibly profitable B33 bluff spot, and this is one of the exploits that I recommend in Grade E of the Carrot Poker School, which is just to make small and frequent bluffs in spots where a villain's range is very wide, and he will have to therefore defend some terrible looking bluff catchers. Frail hands aren't always folds. We're going to assume that if they don't have redraw on the turn, then they will be, and they will always be folds on the river. But pre-river, a frail hand, and I think we'll just use this term for the turn only because the flop, I think equities run a bit too close together for these to be useful notions. But on the turn, a frail hand is going to be a call whenever it's got a lot of redraw equity. To recap, a frail hand doesn't beat one or more bluffs in villain's range, but that doesn't make it a hand that lacks the equity or EV to call necessarily. It could have redraw. Let's think about tiering a bluff catcher and do some real practice here. We have a blind versus blind node where flop goes check check. I think small blind will be checking around 40, 50 to 60% of range on this flop probably, using small bets the rest of the time theoretically. Big blind checks back here and small blind goes for the B75 on this turn. On this turn I tend to just recommend either an overbet or a block bet because I think it more accurately describes the hands that small blind wants to value bet. I can see some really clear examples of very powerful hands like overpairs ace jack king jack set, and I can see some clear examples of thin value bets like 7x pocket 8s, ace 5, jack bad kicker that can just block bet. I don't think there's a reason to really use B75 here, but if that's the sizing you're most acquainted with, it's not really going to be hemorrhaging money to use this size either. But our decision today comes from the person facing the bet. In this instance, that's big blind. So how should big blind react in this spot on the river? The first thing to note is that we're going to call a normal amount of the time. You'll recall that when we get rid of the effect of the frail hands and the value beaters from our range, we end up having to call around half of our bluff catchers in order to reach that 57% defense frequency that our range requires against this sizing. This is not a spot that's massively unfavorable because we're facing multiple bets, and therefore we will want to approach MDF in this situation. There might be some slight overfolding going on here due to the queen's unfavorability for big blind, but I don't think it will be very big. Luckily, B75 is the most intuitive size to play against because you just call half of your catchers and you call all value beaters and fold all frail hands on the river at least. And therefore it's really quite fortunate because this is actually the size that the pool loves to use the most. This is the kind of bet size you will see from recreational players because it's normalized and we copy our peers. We play in a live 1-3 game. Everyone's betting between half pot and 75% pot. You do that too. You watch some high stakes poker show and you see people betting 75% pot and you do that too. You do what you're used to, you do what you've always done, it's habitual. And so people like to use this bet size whenever they're simplifying to one sizing and haven't studied other bet sizes enough. I don't even think it's the most intuitive thing to do personally, and when you get a good understanding of how sizing works in game theory, I think you'll quickly move away from this sort of creche approach of just using almost like the kindergarten approach, if you like, of using B75 because you've just not learned yet how to do anything else. But you see a lot of people do this, all stakes actually, and it's not a bad sizing for theory in many spots too, so it's really common and it's intuitive to play against. With the above bar, we're going to fill in some hands in a minute. You're going to see some combos appearing above, but first I'd like you to have a go at this yourselves. Can you think of an example of a big blind hand that fits each hand class? That means finding a frail hand, which you're going to be folding because this is river, a bad catcher, an average catcher, a good catcher, and a value beater. Remember, the further to the left you are, the stronger your hand, the higher the call frequency. Catcher B in this situation is the sort of hand that's going to be mixing call with fold, so that should be your indifference point if that helps when plotting your range out here. Okay, I'll let you pause the video and I'll let you unpause now and we'll go over the answers if you're ready. First off though, just remember, a catcher's tier may change with the sizing. So when you've done this exercise, which you already have, and you're happy with your answers, you'll need to reorder the catchers for different sizes that we could face in this spot. You won't have the same blocker properties against B150 as you have against B75, nor will you have the same value beater threshold where a hand starts to beat value bets because villain's range will be much thicker for value when they use a bigger sizing. But a value beater here is something like Jack 8. You might look at this hand and think, surely this is just a bluff catcher, but flop went check check and we are blind versus blind. So small blind is able to value bet some weaker jacks than this. They do have combos of Jack 6 and Jack 4 in this spot, and of course chopping with Jack 8 is also going to be reasonable. I think this is in chips here, the EV, and what this is saying is that we're winning 30 chips by calling here, which is about 3 big blinds. That's quite a lot of money, so folding a hand like a jack here is a very big mistake. You could end up folding here if you convince yourself that this was just a bluff catcher, but of course the queen is very bricky to both ranges. Well, not so much the small blinds, but the big blinds range, the queen is very bricky, because when we face this B75 on the turn from small blind, we're not going to be calling naked queen X very often, nor do we have too many combos that hit 2 pair by hitting this queen on the river. A hand like queen jack in our range, meanwhile, will have obviously bet the flop at some frequency, and queens will have 3-bet pre at full frequency, so won't exist. This hand is better than it looks, and I think small blind versus big blind is a tricky situation in general where you have to be super switched on about how good your catcher is in this scenario specifically. A grade A catcher is something like ace 7. This doesn't beat any value bets because of course villain doesn't get so overzealous here in theory that they're value betting a 7 for any frequency, but what happens here is that we have a very good bluff catcher. One idea here is that our opponent's bluffs are mainly going to be shifted away from ace high, which is a hand that will very often check turn. So if villain is b75ing twice here, they usually have a hand like king x as a bluff, 10x, 9x, that sort of thing. So the cards that you really want to unblock here, and last time we talked about the importance of unblocking the weaker part of our opponent's range in the context of bluffing and unblocking folds, but the same thing happens here with calling and unblocking bluffs. And that can actually be more important than blocking value hands, as we've said. So the problem with trying to block villain's value here is that the Jack X and Queen X that they're betting with just have a myriad of different kickers. They're very hard to pin down through holding one single card. Meanwhile, the bluffs do tend to fall around certain cards. They tend to share combos that are playable pre-flop, or ranks of card I should say, that are playable pre-flop, like a 9, a 10, an 8, a 6, a queen, a king rather. That sort of thing. Therefore, I guess we can sort of cluster our calls around unblocking those more effectively than we can cluster them around blocking value hands in this spot, because value hands are generally one pair and they have all different kinds of kickers. 10-7 suited, this is a hand that falls right in the middle of your range. You can tell that it's worse because the side card that goes with the 7 is one that's going to block a lot of bluffs and not block really all that many value hands. You will block some Jack 10, Queen Jack with this hand, and the 7 is useful for obviously blocking some hands like Queen 7 that just got there, although I'm not sure that b75 is the turn actually, maybe it can, but yeah, it's not super prevalent. 10-7 is a hand that's fine, you know, having a card on the board is always better than having a pocket pair, but when you have what we call a dangler kicker, that's a kicker that interferes with your opponent's bluffing range because it's a relevant card. If you had 7-3 suited here, God forbid, you played that hand pre-flop, of course you shouldn't, and you made it to the river, the 3 would not be a dangler because the 3 is too insignificantly abundant in small blind's range. It just doesn't exist enough. It's more of an innocuous or blank card, but the 10 is a dangler because it dangles in the way of villain's bluffs. It's basically a card that isn't hitting anything. It's just floating there, removing other combos that are prevalent that haven't hit anything. That's going to block bluffs. But 10-7 is a hand that you can still call because when you have a pair on the board, even with a bad kicker against this action sequence, you're going to have average removal. You have one good blocker and one bad one. That's going to even itself out and give you a grade B catcher. Grade C catchers are things with 2 blockers, let's say maximum. In PLO, it's kind of funny. You can have like 4 blockers to your opponent's bluff. Sometimes it's like really ridiculous. But in Hold'em, of course, you can't. Having 2 8s here is pretty bad because 9-8, 8-6, 10-8, these kind of combos are very common in small blind's range pre-flop. They're going to be raising these a lot because of the late position. Some of them even in offsuit form, like 8-9 off, I think can be raised sometimes. 10-9 off, this sort of thing. So 8s, 9s, 10s, these are like the real danger zone cards that are going to be the most prevalent danglers. And when you have 2 of them, you're just going to have a really losing call. You can see here that hierarchically, 8s is better than 10-7. It's above 10-7 in the hand rankings, but because 8s is never being pit against 10-7 here, that's irrelevant. Villain doesn't have 10-7 or 8, so why does it matter which one is better out of 8s or 10-7? All that matters is which one is better against villain's range. You're not pitting them head to head. We want to avoid this linearization pitfall, as always in poker, where we're tempted to call from the top down and say a jack is above a 7, which is above a 5, 8s is above a 7, so we'll call that before a 7, but actually 8s is a worse call than almost any 7x combo, well, all 7x combos, because it has 2 danglers, it has 2 blockers to bluffs, and absolutely really no blockers to value at all, apart from some rare Queen 8 suited. Frail hands are, needless to say, going to be hemorrhaging money to call. We're going to be folding a hand like the King 4 of Spades, because not only does this hand lose to all value bets just like our 3 bluff catchers do here, but this hand also loses to some bluffs. Villain could reach this node with something like King 9 and bluff again, and is incentivized indeed to do so, because the Queen is such a good card for their range. Therefore, with a hand like King 4, it's pretty embarrassing when you call down, run into a bluff, and still lose. Let's pitch this hand. Let's take the same spot now, same run out, but the only difference now is that both bets that we're faced here are actually B33. This is going to make ranges much wider to begin with on the turn and then on the river as well. Facing B33, we must call very often indeed in neutral worlds like this one. The reason it's neutral is that although small blind started off with a slight advantage here, just having a better range pre-flop, when they're out of position, their EV goes down a bit, but also when they bet the turn and we call, We shed the bottom 22% of our range, I believe, something like that in this spot, just underfolding slightly compared to the pot odds norm when in position, therefore strengthen our range to the point that we become an equity favourite, but the queen will then offset that again and make the world a bit more neutral. So that's why we end up in a neutral spot here for range. Can you think of an example of a big blind hand then that fits into each hand class like we did previously? Pause the video, give this one a bash, and let's see how we do. Remember that your catcher's tier will change with blocker interactions. We're now facing a smaller bet, so we're going to be facing a wider value range here. Ace-7 is now a value beater. This hand has been promoted. Look what's happened to the EV in the previous slide when we saw the EV of calling A7. If we just skip back here, it had 3.75 chips here, which is a bit less than a small blind for calling, but a really good result for a bluff catcher hand, certainly like one of the highest EVs we can expect from merely bluff catching. But this hand, now that it's a value beater, is going to be entitled to about 3 big blinds. If you see huge pot entitlement, like multiple big blinds, 20% pot, 30% pot, that sort of thing from calling a hand, you can be pretty confident that that hand is never just a catcher. A catcher, even if it's grade A, is going to hover around 0. It's going to be a bit above 0 when it's your best catcher and a bit below 0 when it's your worst one. But it's really rare for a catcher to be hemorrhaging multiple big blinds, 20% pot, or winning such an amount by calling. So when you see this EV, this is always value beater EV. Why is it value beater EV? Because for this minimal investment here in a wide range configuration where the queen misses big blind's range, small blind is able to value bet weaker 7x in this pretty confidently. While they may not be betting 4s or 5x or 3s or something or deuce x, they are going to be betting 7x, and therefore this is a value beater. It's very important to understand that this hand is not just a catcher theoretically on this node. The idea is that villain, in game theory, just has bigger sizes here and will often just wield check raises or overbets with the top of their range, and just will very rarely have a really good hand for going block here. That's supposed to be a thin value region. That's not an exploitable thing that villain's doing as long as they remember to bluff sometimes, but they shouldn't be bluffing very often for this sizing. I'd say exploitatively speaking, when it comes to what you do with your bluff catcher region, in this spot, it's going to be really opponent dependent. There are some people at lower stakes that just aren't capable of building a bluffing range at all for this sizing, and the people who do build a bluffing range are just always over bluffing because it's effectively very difficult to bluff only 20% of the time. Remember, if you 1/3 pot, your opponent only needs 20% equity to break even, and since you're in a neutral world where your goal is to make the opponent's average bluff catcher indifferent, then you need to be value betting 4/5 of the time that you're betting here, and that's really hard to do. Once you start bluffing here, it's like opening a can of worms, and it's very, very easy to start over bluffing quickly. 5-3 is a good catcher. Why is this one a catcher? Well, it doesn't beat any value bets. Villain doesn't bet as wide as 5x here, especially not pocket 4s or deuce x as we say, or values, so we do only beat bluffs here. It's a good catcher though because we're blocking some value combos with the 5, and the 3 you should be beginning to identify by now as a positive card to have because it's so innocuous. It's really easy to block your opponent's bluffs in this node. All you have to do is have a 6, a 9, a 10, a king, that sort of hand rank. If you have a 5 and a 3, it's just very unlikely that you're going to interfere with very many bluffing combos, but you will interfere with a few value combos. So this is a very positive blocker effect, and it's a grade A catcher, but you can see that even a grade A catcher against this sizing doesn't come in at very much EV at all, only winning 1.46 chips, so basically like 1/10 of a big blind, slightly more. Another thing I would like to stipulate here is that there is some raise going on with the 5-3, and you might look at that and think, what is that all about? Clearly it's not value raising, right? It's not good enough for that. This is a bluff raise. The idea is that when we're raising in these spots, not always, but very commonly, we want to select hands that are actually okay to call with. The reason for this is that we have to adhere to a concept called interference theorem that we've met already in grade 3 of the Carrot Poker School. To reiterate interference theorem, which you may remember by that old static picture on the TV that came up on the slide, is the concept that you need to be interfering with your opponent's value bets in order to repolarize. This is very often the case, so you want to have a card here that blocks the kickers of the Jack X, Queen X region that's most likely to bet call, or have something like a 5 appear on the board that blocks something like 2 pair. So 5-3, reasonable hand to actually raise with here, sparingly. You're not doing a lot of raising, your range is very capped, having checked flop back and called turn, so you're not going to be doing a ton of raising, but this is the sort of hand that wouldn't be a mistake to raise if you wanted to. Pocket 4s is a grade B catcher. These cards are low enough down that they're quite innocuous and they're not interfering a ton with villain's bluffing range, which is a good thing. That's a pro. A con for this hand would just be it doesn't have any pair on the board and thus has less blockers to value, and it will remove some bluffs here. Something like 4-6 suited or ace-4 could potentially bluff on this node, while I think ace-x that's big is going to be checking down here for some limited SDV. I think there'll be some weak ace-x combos that continue to bluff on this node for this sizing. And a bad catcher here, something that's losing considerable amounts of money by calling, is something like king 10. This hand is really bizarre because the solver thinks it's break even to raise but losing to call. I think the reason for this is that it does a very good job of targeting the very top of the opponent's range with its blockers. Villain's best value bets here probably do contain a king or a 10 quite often because they're value betting stuff like king jack on this node, jack 10, etc. Maybe queen 10 from time to time, but I think that can use a bigger sizing and often will in game theory. So this hand has okay removal. The thing with it is though that it is blocking a lot of bluffs at the same time, so it's a kind of bittersweet hand that's reasonable to raise with. But the thing is, I'm not convinced that just because the solver chooses this hand 80% of the time to raise that we need to do the same. The frequency is somewhat arbitrary. If this doesn't look like a hand that you should be raising here, I'm okay with you just folding this and then raising some hands like 5-3 or pocket 4s instead. I think one reason the solver chooses this as a raise very frequently is to offset the blocker effect that would happen in our range if we only raise hands like pocket 4s and 5-3. In other words, we do need to raise some bigger cards as well, because that's going to affect how incentivized our opponent is to bluff with certain holdings. So if we were never raising a hand like king 10, whenever a villain had a hand that contained a king or a 10, let's say themselves, they would not be blocking our raising range and we'd be raising very frequently. But when we raise this, we basically mix up our blockers and make our strategy less counter-exploitable. This is a very small point. It's mainly just theoretical and meta, and I wouldn't worry too much about it in the real world. We don't study GTO to copy every fine detail and try and be perfect with our combinatoric removal frequencies and things of this nature. We study GTO to get a sense of why EV functions the way it does and how we can manipulate EV to our advantage in games. So I'm totally fine with you guys kind of shunning this idea that this specific hand has to be raised this high frequency. And a hand like 10-9 just becomes too negative. It no longer has blockers to the best Jack X that's looking to bet call here, and this hand will block far more combos of bluffs in our opponent's range. The 10, the 9, and the 8 are probably the biggest criminal danglers here, the ones that block the most bluffs in our opponent's range, and you can just see what happens to the EV of raise here. It swings from 0 to minus 1.33 with these cards, and yeah, you just want to avoid raising negative blockers. Clearly calling with a frail hand would also just be totally absurd, but that's not even the main point here. The point is that any investment becomes worse when your danglers become more significant and interfere with villains' bluffs at a higher frequency. Let's look at facing overbets then before we move on from this exercise. We'll do this one more time for good measure. So again, same run out. This time we face overbet. Overbet. I actually really like this line from small blind. I think this is a great way to play in this situation. I think you can block bet too, but the reason, as I mentioned earlier, that overbet is good here, just to recap, is that you just have a lot of nutted combos now on a blank turn. After your in-position opponent elects to check behind on the flop. That's really key. While small blind's checking range on the flop can still be uncapped and contain some hands with quite a large amount of equity that we're check raising or planning to, big blind will be incentivized to just pure bet many of their ace-jack plus combos here. Therefore, big blind's range is much more capped than small blind, so when we land on a brick turn that doesn't offset that nut advantage that we gain on the flop, we can actually consider using overbets. Here we place a premium on blocking value bets and unblocking bluffs, and the reason for this is it's just much more important when we face B150 that the blockers are chosen carefully, because blockers can swing EV a lot more as ranges get narrower and start to feature certain cards much more often. So the value bets that we run into when we face this are going to be much more concentrated around certain hands like overpairs and good queen X than they would have been before where we face the smaller sizing. Let me ask you guys to do this exercise one more time. Take your time, think about what's different sizing wise. Remember, the catcher's tier is going to change. This is always important to remember based on blocker interactions for different bet sizes. Have a think about it and let's go over the answers now. I'll assume that you've unpaused the video and you're ready. A value beater now has to be something like a queen. Queen 8 is actually good enough, and this kind of shocks people. They might think, well, why is villain going so big with a lousy kicker like queen 6 here? because they are, small blind is value betting queen 8 or queen 6 sometimes. If they weren't, you wouldn't have 17 chips here, 1.7 big blinds, 510 model for queen 8. The EV could never be that high if this hand was simply a raw bluff catcher. It just couldn't be, because only blockers alone are not enough to swing EV by this sort of margin. You have to be beating a disproportionate amount of your opponent's range to get this higher calling EV, and the only way you can do that hand strength wise is to have a value beater rather than a bluff catcher. The reason that this occurs here is that our opponent in the small blind is happily value betting queen X because it's such a brick for our range. When we call a turn overbet, one of the last combos we're expected to show up with is a queen, especially when it's impossible for us to have the queen of spades. So if villain had a spade queen here, they'd be even more willing to value bet because that's the main queen that they'd be worried about running into. With the queen of diamonds or queen of clubs, they can still value bet though, because by far our most abundant hands here are Jack X, pocket pair, 7X, ace high, busted draw, frail hand, etc. We're going to have to call plenty of Jack X and 7X to a river overbet here, lest we're just going to overfold our range horrifically, and therefore villain can and should overbet with some queen X combos, even if their kickers are not that stellar. A good catcher is something like king 7. The king is going to have positive removal to king queen, which is a really common, I think, bluff now. Something like king of spades, queen X, king of something, queen of spades. These are going to be hands that our opponent value bets here, but most importantly, the 7 is a blocker to pocket 7s, and pocket 7s is now absolutely firmly and frequently in villain's range, given that they've overbet turn and river. This is a classic example of a value combo that they're going to choose this line with pretty often. The 7 is great for blocking value range, blocking top pair, unblocking bluffs. The king is good for blocking the best queen X, or one of the best queen X, and so I think this hand is just a clearly winning call, coming in at half a big blind. Throwing away half a big blind by folding here because you rank your hand as a lowly pair of 7s is a big mistake against a balanced opponent, and even more so against someone that's over bluffing. And in this situation, you just want to be able to rate your hand based on its properties and not its absolute strength. These two hands are pretty close together. Jack 8's a break-even call, 10-7 is losing. What's going on here? Well, Jack 8 appears to have just as bad a dangler as 10-7, but I think the 8 dangler is a little bit less severe than the 10 dangler, and moreover, I think the X factor, as we called it in the previous lecture, is better for Jack 8 because you're just blocking more value bets with the Jack than you are with the 7, because the Jack can combine in offsuit combinatoric ways to form two pair, whereas the 7 can't. In other words, and more specifically, while villain can have something like Queen Jack off here, they're not going to have something like Queen 7 off. So the Jack is a more useful blocker to value. A bad catcher here, and one that's actually coming in at a huge EV loss, losing a whole big blind. This is about as bad as it can really get for a bluff catcher to lose this amount of the pot, is 6-5 suited. This hand is interesting. You would think the 5 would be a decent hand to have here because it does block a couple of two-pair combos and it also blocks pocket 5s, so it's a little bit surprising. The 6, on the other hand, is a dangler, and it's probably one of the most severe danglers we can have, specifically for the overbet sizing, because villain is going to want to unblock bigger spades here when they're bluffing. They're going to want to bluff with smaller cards. So the 6 of spades is actually one of the few missed spade cards that villain is going to want to bluff on the river, because we don't have the 6 of spades that often on this action sequence, but we do have bigger spades and bigger cards that are folding here, i.e. straight draws and flush draws that missed. So 6-5 is one of the worst calls we can have. I think there's a bit of specific solver versus solver metagame going on with this combo. I don't know exactly what without looking at the sim, but I suspect there's some effect here where these cards in particular are just falling in such a way that villain bluffs more often when they're holding them. That may or may not be something that humans do. It depends on the reasons for that and how sort of meta they get. A frail hand would be a fold, of course. Calling 9-8 would be absurd, losing a lot of money, and of course the idea that we could raise here is also kind of absurd with a hand with this amount of danglers, this amount of negative blockers. If you're crafting a raise here, and you can do that, you're going to really want to interfere with the opponent's calling range now, and the only hand depicted on screen here that you can see enjoys a little bit of raise frequency is the Jack 8 of hearts, and the reason for that is that the Jack is an interference card. It gets in the way of two pair, it gets in the way of second set, it removes a lot of these hands that villain would be bet calling. What you want to do is unblock the bet fold range here for value and as a bluff, and block the bet call range. The Jack is quite nice because it doesn't really block that many bet folds for value, because villain isn't really overbetting that many Jack X for value on this node. However, the jack X that villain is value betting is going to be bet calling because it's going to be queen jack jack 7 pocket jacks. So the jack is a useful and sensible card to have and makes a break even raise even with the 8 dangler present. It's also important to note here that we need to keep the raise frequency very much in check. We wouldn't want to raise frequently here as the big blind because we have almost no value combos. So the minute we start going, oh hey, these blockers look good, let's raise this hand, that's the very second we begin over bluffing profusely. So let's be careful here. Let's just refrain from this sort of play for the most part. If you do want to roll it in your RNG, you should be rolling it like 5% of the time. I'm definitely guilty for being on stream and being like, guys, look at this cool bluff, look at this blocker. And then if I make that raise just once because I feel like it, I've just overbluffed like an absolute maniac. So you have to be a bit careful. Let's discuss counterintuitive defense now. What I'm about to show you looks a bit bizarre, and at face value it looks plain wrong, but when you think about it a bit more, it's actually very sensible. A bluff catching spot often requires counterintuitive defense. Many lower absolute hand strength combos have higher calling EV than combos of higher absolute hand strength. I was doing a lesson with a student actually 2 days ago where the student had got to the river with a hand that was pocket kings, it was an overpair, and she'd value bet the turn and been raised and then faced the river jam. And by the time she'd faced the river jam, the pocket kings had actually plummeted to being a bluff catcher. But because they look so much better than other bluff catchers that the student wouldn't have for, let's say, pocket 5s, pocket 9s, I asked her, like, how would you feel about having 5s here? And she said, well, I just fold, that's a terrible hand. And I said, well, it's actually the same as kings. Only kings is worse because it blocks more bluffs in your opponent's range. So sometimes the lesson is you have to call a hand that's much lower down the absolute hand ranking grid than one that's higher up. And that just looks wrong, but it's actually right. The more polarized your opponent's range becomes, the more counterintuitive the defense will become for you, because your big hands will be just as good as your not so big looking hands, because villain's so polar that it doesn't matter anymore whether you have a hand that's, put it this way, villain's hand strength is 100, then it doesn't matter whether you have 92 or 50. If villain's hand strength is either 100 or 0, 92 and 50 are the same. Even though 92 would beat 50, they're not playing against each other, that's the key. They're playing against a very polar range. Like this one. In this 3-bet pot, small blind range bets the flop, B60s the turn, and then shoves the remainder, the B67, on the river, and hijack just goes call, call. Uh-oh, what do I do? If you were hijack, which of these hands would you consider calling with? Your instinct here, unless you're a very strong experienced player, will be I'll call queen. I'll probably not call either of them, or I'll mix them, or I'm not sure, but maybe I'll call queens before I would call nines. Most people just see queens as a better hand than nines in this spot because the brain is really annoying. The brain loves to get us in trouble, and our initial reaction is caused by visual processing. It's a very visceral, instinctive reaction, and that's just that queen is higher than 9. And that sounds absolutely barbaric and simpleton thought process. Queen is higher than 9, but that's the very first thing that our brain does, our lizard brain does when it sees this spot. Then the prefrontal cortex and all of the logical, explicit thinking mechanisms will kick in, and then you have a chance of actually solving this. And to solve this, you just need to understand that the small blind doesn't have a 9 here as a bluff very often. The queen is a dangler because it blocks the most likely unpaired hands that choose to 3-bet preflop in the first place. This all comes down to preflop hand selection. You don't get a lot of 3-betting from ace 9, 10 9, jack 9, anything like this in these situations, but you do see ace queen offsuit. I stress the offsuit part that makes the hand more abundant. You see hands like this 3-betting in these spots. Therefore, 9s is a break-even call. It's one you're supposed to make because you just don't have a lot of break-even calls here. Most of your bluffs are blocking your opponent's bluffing range, so you actually meant to call this one all the time and fold this one all the time. And the EV swing is pretty huge, 2 big blind swing between these hands, and that will add up long term. It might not feel like a lot or be very noticeable in the moment when you're playing a 200 big blind pot, but overall this will add up. So you need to pitch queens here and call 9s if you want to play in a theoretically sound way. I think in practice what you'll see people do here, even in fairly tough games, is usually fold both of these hands but call queens slightly more often than 9s. That's a protocol error. The cat's confused. Don't be confused. Don't be the cat. You got this, guys. Just think in terms of blockers. Reject that initial visually processed response to the spot. That's the thing that's messing you up. It's not your fault. It's just a natural mechanism our brains do. We have to learn to recognize it, interrupt it, and say no thank you to that interpretation that queens is more of a call than 9s. This brings us on to a theorem about relative hand strength. And as is typical grade 3 Carrot Poker School fashion, we're going to name this after another memorable animal, the mantis. Mantis theorem, and I like to think of this creature as like some kind of wise, smug, patronizing kind of insect. I don't know, he just has that look on his face, doesn't he? But the mantis theorem says that the silly human overfolds on drier textures and when ranges are wide, and overdefends on wetter textures and when ranges are tight. And the very simple reason for this is about first impression, hand strength, snap judgments, and relative hand strength in these scenarios. On drier textures and when ranges are wide, your range is just going to be weaker than average, and therefore a certain hand in our range that doesn't look particularly impressive is actually just going to be far stronger than the norm. Meanwhile, on wetter textures and when ranges are tight, a hand is going to be further down our range and worse compared to our opponent's range than average, and is going to be weaker and more foldable than you would think. So that's why not enough folding happens in these wet 3 flush turn, 3 straight situations, 3 broadways, tight configurations under the gun versus big blind. People are too sticky there because they're applying this face value arbitrary standard of hand strength. But then when we move on to like blind versus blind, button versus blind, super dry run out, nothing much going on, people are overfolding king high bluff catchers by always folding them, even though they need to call like 70% of the time against a small bet. It gets really ridiculous. Let us now set out to disprove this patronizing mantis, and can we get the following examples right? What we're about to do is learn how to upgrade and downgrade our bluff catchers and value beater thresholds based on wetness, dryness, wideness, tightness, configurations being early or late, all of the precursors that will map out our relative hand strength in various different ways. And we want to get good at this because this is the essence of poker, is being able to be a fluid player who can adapt to these changing circumstances and track them throughout the course of a hand. Let's start with downgrading our holding for the wetness of the texture that comes down. In this spot, the runout is going to be so wet that some pretty strong looking hands are very trivial folds once our opponent polarizes and of course reduces their strength to bluff catchers. The thing about queens and nines in the previous slide was that they were both bluff catchers, and once we establish that, we have no reason other than blockers to prefer one to the other. When the blocker properties of these hands are mostly negative, they must be folded depending on sizing unless it's like a block bet. Button goes for B33, B150, and then finally B75 here, and big blind check calls his way down to the river and then faces this final bet. You'll note here that this runout is horrific. It completes almost everything that the button is barreling with, although there will be some imaginative bluffs. The solver finds like king 7 of clubs that still brick here. A lot of humans end up under bluffing 3 straight, 3 flush, Broadway, heavy textures like this one. So this is one that you probably want to overfold against humans even more so than in GTO, but people have the opposite reaction. It's quite interesting that because something like 2-pair just looks really good, people end up calling these hands when actually these need to be downgraded for the wetness of the situation. So I've given you some spoilers there, but how would you rate the following hands in the bluff catcher system? Where would you put Queen Jack, Ace 8, Ace Jack, and King Queen? Write down some answers and then we'll go over where these hands actually fit into our model. Let's assume that you've done that and let's go. Queen Jack is a bad bluff catcher. This hand is beating absolutely no value bets whatsoever for this run out. No, villain is not a complete maniac who's lost all track of relative hand strength and is tripling off Ace King. That's not happening. You can tell yourself that's happening if you really want to invent reasons to call, but theoretically that's absurd, and of course on such a run out, button needs to be sensitive to that and not go for thin value with 1 pair on the river. Therefore, Queen Jack is a bluff. The reason it has negative blockers is that this is such a difficult spot to miss. This texture is so hard not to interact with by the river that villain will actually be bluffing some combos like Jack X here. Therefore, the Jack is actually functioning as a negative blocker. It's removing gutters like Jack 10 or Jack 8, King Jack that bet turn in and now incentivized to actually follow through, just given the ridiculous wetness and the difficulty with which you can miss this run out. So Queen Jack, folding. Grade C, bluff catcher, no thank you. Why does villain's sizing go down, by the way? This is a question that you might be thinking. I'm almost imagining someone in Twitch chat, like been streaming too much obviously, but writing this question, and I'm thinking the reason that the sizing goes down again is that big blind's range actually gets polarized by this river, and button will now have a thin value region that they wouldn't have had on a brick river where they're just jamming or checking back. So that's the reason for that, in case you're wondering. That just occurred to me. Back to the exercise, Ace of Diamonds, 8 of Spades. This hand is also clearly a bluff catcher. Villain, while they'll be bluffing some combos of lower pairs here, they're not going to be bluffing Ace X. We're beating all bluffs here with the ace. The nut flush combos in villain's range will sometimes be using a bigger sizing. They will be jamming, but sometimes they can use the size as well, I believe. So this is definitely still a positive blocker to have. And this bluff catcher is grade A. So despite being a much weaker hand than Queen Jack objectively speaking, we can note that this hand is a pure call, coming in at half a big blind win, whereas the Queen Jack is losing more than half a big blind. That's more than a big blind swing, going from grade C to grade A here. That's not a lot in this sort of pot. It's not a big equity swing, clearly. Now, one thing I want to be very explicit about is that the impact of blockers is minimal, but when there's nothing else to go on, it is the deal breaker between winning and losing. So if you just call arbitrarily because you're like, oh, blockers don't really matter, in the long term, they do add up and it'll have a massive effect on your bottom line. But what we should also admit is that when someone is under bluffing, and in a spot like this, almost everybody is under bluffing, apart from absolute crushers or complete maniacs that have like 5-6 off for reaching this node. Apart from those two player types, everybody under bluff, so actually calling ace of diamonds 8 here is probably just a bad idea against most humans. You should reject the solver's recommendation in spots that you think are just incredibly difficult to bluff in, which require a high degree of creativity in order to reach the quota of bluffs that you need. Ace Jack, this is definitely a bit better than Queen Jack, but it's still a bluff catcher. This hand is not a value beater. Villain doesn't start value betting here until at least Ace Queen with Ace of Diamonds, I believe, if I remember this sim correctly. Been a while since I looked at the whole sim, but I'm pretty sure that's what's going on. The Ace Jack of clubs here then, this hand is really going to be struggling to do well against humans. It's going to get massacred, in fact, and it's only breaking even against the solver, who's actually bluffing a bunch of their Jack 10 type combos on this node. King Queen with the King of Diamonds, this one is obviously quite unique, and if you found the answer here of raising, then congratulations. This hand is a very, very good bluff catcher, and the reason for this is that when button overbets the turn, they actually don't have the Ace of Diamonds very often because that's a showdown value hand. And if they have very good Ace of Diamonds like Ace King, they can be going for it here. But for the most part, Ace X of Diamonds with a low kicker will be picking a smaller sizing or checking. So when we get to the river here, the King High Flush is actually the most abundant one in villain's range. So in terms of X factor, meaning interfering with villain's good hands, remember Y factor would be not interfering with villain's bad hands, the King of Diamonds is incredibly good. The Queen of Clubs is also really good because villain doesn't bluff too much Queen X here, sticking mainly to things like Jack X when they're bluffing the river. So the Queen is a reasonable card, blocking a set, blocking Ace Queen with Ace of Diamonds that I believe can value bet here. And then the King Queen is just a great hand because the King of Diamonds is the most positive blocker imaginable, and villain isn't really doing a ton of bluffing with the King of Diamonds on this node because King X of Diamonds got there, and offsuit kings mostly have pairs. Maybe King Jack is one example that bluffs, but villain won't have a hand on this node like the King of Diamonds 5 of Hearts, because that would have just folded pre-flop. So another thing about these big Broadway boards is that they tend to cause offsuit hands to always pair up or make a straight or something like that, because offsuit hands are just too high to miss this board, whereas suited hands can miss. But then not that many people find barrels with 6-7 of clubs on the turn. This is why this spot's under bluffed. In theory, raise is good with this hand. In practice, raise is less good because people are not reacting enough to wetness and getting jammed on here. But this is exactly the sort of hand that not only can you jam, but you have to jam. And this is a great example of the phenomenon where when ranges get really snug, because villain is triple barreled, blockers become even more important because you're now removing a brick from a smaller wall. So the brick you remove by having a blocker is a bigger percentage of that wall than it would be if the wall contained more bricks to start with. If you follow that analogy, what we're basically saying in poker terms is that the range for tripling here is quite unique and very centered around certain value combos, so the effect of blocking those can have a much greater impact than it would in a wider range spot with less range filtering taking place. Upgrading for dryness now. When runouts are really hard to connect with, seemingly air hands are promoted to bluff catchers, remember that. No matter how good we get and how proficient we get in this game, our infantile poker mind, the one that makes that snap judgment, will retain their biases about an absolute hand strength with the risk of skewing our evaluations. So if we're more sentient of this risk in the first place, we can interrupt it more in game and actually increase our chances of stopping ourselves in the act of misevaluating our relative hand strength. What we need to do is learn what it feels like to make a snap judgment. How is that different to explicit cognition and problem solving? And can we detect when our brain is doing one as opposed to the other? When we identify snap judgments entering the fray, we can interrupt them and say, let's pause for thought here. My infantile brain doesn't understand these ridiculously dry, hard to connect with textures, nor does it understand the really wet ones. What it's doing is going off the sort of median texture, the middling one, and so we want to be aware that we may need to interfere and do some conscious evaluating. Big blind against button, check on the flop and on the turn, and then it's a B33 stab from big blind on the river. Clearly button has to defend an obscene amount of the time here, being in position and retaining some range advantage throughout. Big blind is in an unfavourable world and will need to bluff sparingly and very thoughtfully here for B33 in order to avoid grossly over bluffing. How would you assess the following 4 hands? Pause the video, write down what you think they are in the bluff catching system, whether you would call, raise or fold with them, and then let's take a look. Queen 7 is an extremely powerful holding. This might shock you. This is percent pot. This hand is entitled to 112% pot by calling and 117% pot by raising. This is absolutely huge, and the idea here is that this hand is clearly just almost invincible, because big blind, when they're lucky enough to actually hit a 7 on the river here, they have a huge holding that's almost always winning against the capped range of button, which check back twice, and so they're incentivized to use a check raise or bigger sizing. When they B33, their value region is mostly going to be ace high, therefore Queen 7 is just the nuts. You want to raise the nuts, because the nuts can't really lose, and when you have a lot of equity you need to value bet, so let's get raising. A6 of diamonds, this is going to be a value beater, in the sense that it will chop with some ace-x combos that villain is actually value betting on this node. When big blind gets here with a hand like ace-6, ace-5, ace-4, they're actually going to have a holding that's capable of value betting because button needs to call so many king high on this node. This hand has too much EV to just be a bluff catcher. That can't be what's going on here, although if it was, it would be a great one. But we're blocking value bets, we're beating value bets, we're chopping with value bets, and we have to call. King Queen is just a bluff catcher. You can see the EV going down towards 0, as it normally does at this point. The raise here is definitely really peculiar. It must just be that when big blind is bluffing here, they're not bluffing king high or queen high as often, they're bluffing lower cards, and so the king and queen are good cards for unblocking bluffs, while simultaneously getting some folds from ace high. It's probably also the case here that when big blind is value betting ace high, they don't have ace king or ace queen from pre-flop, they would have 3-bet those. And so we do a decent job of unblocking some of the ace high value bets that may actually be bet folding here, and that's going to be a good thing. If we had cards like a 10, a 9, a jack in our range here, they're maybe less good for raising because some of our opponents' bet folds are things like ace 9 for value. And king 5, a kind of peculiar hand, but this is a bluff catcher, and it's the kind of bluff catcher we really want to have. It's grade A. Why is this hand grade A? Because busted flush draws are great to have on nodes that have been reached very passively. When villain actually goes check all the way through the hand here, the spades are going to do the best job of unblocking air, because spade air would have bet earlier more frequently than other suits. Probably the worst suit to have here is something like clubs, because clubs is going to check flop at the highest frequency. It's all about how you arrive on a spot. Remember, you want the busted flush draws when it's passively played, because there's no reason to think your opponent has moved towards those, but you want to have the other suits if villain has been blasting off. However, do note that even if villain is tripling, you might want to call a busted flush draw on the river, because they're incentivized to give up those bluffs instead of following through. All is not what it seems with blockers here. This is an incredibly difficult spot. It's very counterintuitive and hard to get right. So spend particular time on this slide just making sure you understand how these hands are being played and why. Downgrading for tightness now. It's not uncommon even for solid players to simply forget that they're in a tighter configuration pre-flop. I've studied a lot of button versus big blind, and I've worked with students on blind versus blind, small blind versus button, 3-bet pots, all of these really common late position battle scenarios. What that means is that I often neglect early position in my own studies because I just forget to do it. And when I find myself in a spot like under the gun against hijack 3-bet pot, I sometimes fail to downgrade for tightness. The configuration is so tight that hands that look reasonable are much further down my range than normal, but I can forget this. So the subconscious can assume that hands are better than they are when you're something like big blind against under the gun, because it's studied and looked at so much big blind versus button. Moreover, you've played a lot more big blind versus button because the spot comes up a lot, so you really have to make an explicit point and go out of your way to stress to yourself that ranges are tighter when the configuration pre-flop is an earlier one. such as this one, small blind versus hijack 3-bet pot, hijack opens pre and small blind goes ahead and throws in a 3-bet, hijack makes the call, small blind B60s on 7-4 deuce, a really good board for their nutted region, and so wielding the nut advantage with a large bet makes a ton of sense. How high do you think the call EV is of the following hands? 9s, 6s, king queen, and jack 10 suited. What do you think is going on here? Pause the video. This is the second last one. I know this has been hard work this class, but don't worry, we have one more to go after this, and then you guys can chill and get on to the homework exercise. The work never stops at the Carrot Poker School. Off we go then. 9s is going to be a call. I don't want to use the terminology of bluff catcher at this point because I think equities just run a bit too close together on the flop. There's not really enough way ahead, way behind definition yet to use these terms sensibly. But 9s is still going to be a call. The idea here is that small blind could have 8s. So if you did want to use bluff catcher terminology, this is definitely a value beater. It's beating pairs in your opponent's range, which I guess are thin value bets, though everything is so close together here that it's hard to say. Pocket 6s is one that you can fold. Note that there aren't actually any pairs in small blind's range lower than this because small blind wouldn't be 3-betting 5s or 3s or something like this against the hijack player. So 6s, I guess you could call it like a pseudo bluff catcher. It does have less equity against bluffs than normal though because we're at an earlier juncture in the hand. And the idea that you can fold a pair with backdoor straight draws here is a little bit of a weird one. On to king queen of diamonds now. This is a hand that comes in at the same EV as 6s, which might be a little bit confusing at first because of course 6s looks like a much stronger hand than king queen, but against villains' more naturally polarized range, it's not that small blind will be very selective of what they're c-betting and polarizing further on this flop, but what small blind will do is just arrive on this flop with a range that's very polar to start with, just consisting of many overpairs and then broadways. So king queen is the kind of hand that has very good pair draw, some backdoors as well. Doesn't really have much showdown value, but when you're against quite a polarized range, actually being able to draw into a good pair is much more important than whether or not you have like a backdoor straight draw to boot. So you'll see hands like this calling, but hands like jack 10 just folding here, jack 10 being a frail hand. Clearly king queen is kind of a frail hand as well, but you can see why the terminology of the bluff catcher system that we introduced for turn onwards is a little bit misleading and weird when applied to the flop. It needs to be modified at the very least, we could say. King queen is going to be a call, as is 6s, and you can actually say that in a spot like this there are two hand classes that become indifferent, bad to mediocre pairs and good broadways with overcards and pair draws. These hands are the same, therefore when you have a good pair like 9s you have a pure call, when you have a bad overcard combo that doesn't have as many live outs to villain's value range like jack 10 because the pair of jacks or 10s is nowhere near as good as a pair of kings. And just to understand that, just imagine how many combos of pocket queens are a dense part of the small blind's 3-bet range, then it makes a lot of sense. Upgrading for wideness finally, when ranges have remained very wide due to an absence of aggression or filtering, so there's not been much polarizing or heavy condensing, maybe some light condensing towards the middle from people checking down, but not so much heavy condensing through someone having to shed their worst hands. In these cases, we're going to need to call some bizarre looking candidates. Here we see one of these so-called still lake textures as introduced in grade 1 of the Carrot Poker School, meaning that these kind of flops are very difficult to connect with, and air is going to be very abundant in both ranges. This is a wide range configuration, and the board runs out in such a way that everything just remains very difficult to hit. Moreover, the action sequence here is going to leave ranges incredibly wide. The filtering effect that happens when big blind calls this range bet is very minimal, and then when turn goes check check, of course ranges weaken, cap a bit, and hand strength becomes extremely low on average. After this action sequence, the B33 in the river, the value range for small blind is going to be much weaker than you would first think, and therefore there are going to be hands in big blind's range here that are bluff catchers that don't look like they should be. How would you assess Queen 7, Pocket 3s, Queen Jack, and King 3 in this spot? Pause the video, have a think, and we'll go over the answers. So the Queen 7 here is an absolute behemoth of a hand, it really is. You just can't state enough how strong this hand is here. Not only is this hand going to be a really profitable call, it's also on the cusp of raising. Not enough of small blind's range for this sizing is going to be ace-x or a pocket pair above a 7, and so there'll be enough value combos here like 7 with worst kicker, 6x or low pocket pair that have to mix calls, and so we can go for this raise. If you're playing against someone that overprotects their block bet range and just blocks too often with hands like jacks here, not understanding that those hands are actually much better than they look, then you're going to want to go ahead and just call here. But if you're against someone who is capped here or even more capped than a solver and would just have a 7 or worse here, then this is a no-brainer raise. Pocket 3s is going to be a value beater. If you look at the call EV and the raise EV, you can see that this is in no way, shape or form just a bluff catcher. When you call here, you're going to be running into certain combos like King Queen or Deuce X or something like that. They're thin value betting that you actually beat. It's close to being a bluff catcher, but it's not one. And if it was a bluff catcher, it'd be a fairly good one based on having innocuous blockers that don't interfere with those danglers that are going to formulate our opponent's bluffing range. That would be the 10, the 9, the 8, the Jack, etc. Probably not the Queen or the King. Those hands are a bit further up. Queen Jack is a bad bluff catcher. This hand is not hemorrhaging enough EV to be considered a frail hand, nor is it losing to any bluff, and our opponent's range villain is not bluffing here with something like King High. If anything, those hands would be a value bet. Queen Jack is not calling here because it does block some Jack X bluffs. It doesn't have any blockers to the value region because villain isn't value betting anything with these cards in them, apart from maybe King Queen, King Jack, but they're also bluffing some Jack High. So overall, just a hand that's cuspy. You can raise with it because at least you unblock the lower cards that villain is going to be bluffing with, and you block some value hands like queens or jacks or something of that nature, maybe the kicker with the 7 in the case of the Queen of Clubs. Overall, average hand, average properties, meant to be a fold, but you know, it's not a million miles away from being a call, but it's a grade C bluff catcher and we're going to let it go. King 3 of diamonds, this is more of a grade A bluff catcher. The 3 is a gem of a card, it's totally innocuous, it's not getting in the way of villain's bluffs, and the king is of course going to be a very powerful card that actually blocks value bets, pocket kings and king high on this node, as well as all of the kickers with the 6 of the 7, because they will be diamonds, they'll be suited hands, not offsuit hands, and the 7 or 6 of diamonds are not out there, so the king of diamonds will block the king 7 and king 6 suited combos in villain's range. Overall, we have a big adjustment necessary here. We really do have to adapt to the wideness and the lack of filtering that's gone on in this slide. Hopefully these last 4 exercises have been helpful. I know they're a lot of work, but it really does help to recalibrate your sense of where the bluff catcher system applies across all of these very different scenarios where there's a lot of different criteria for assessing relative hand strength. Homework task 5, I'd like to go back to 9 through 12, those slides again. That's where we adapted for wideness, tightness, wetness and dryness, and explore whether you think pool will over or under bluff each of these spots. Why would this happen? We're trying to work on exploitative play a little bit more. While this is a theoretical school, it definitely behooves us to practice our exploitative senses and try to sharpen our skills in this regard. Secondly, how will this change the EV of the 4 hands listed on this slide, and do you want to actually reject the solver's advice and deviate? When we get to grade 3 level, we should be thinking about GTO in an intelligent and flexible way where we're happy deviating. Thirdly, I'd like you to create a memorable heuristic or rule for each of these to help you implement a strong exploitative strategy going forward. If it helps, open up these in a sim yourself, run them, and have a look at what the opponent is actually meant to do. If a hand, for example, is cited as a raise on the river for value by a pile solver or any other solving tool that you're using, why is that? How does the other player's strategy react to that raise? And do you agree that the raise will be as effective against real life populations? I'll see you back here for lecture 6 of grade 3. Hope you're enjoying the course so far. I'll see you soon, guys. Bye for now.